They called Jeremiah Grant Halfman, like it was some kind of joke. But on that plantation, everyone understood. At any moment, he could be killed simply to amuse someone. It was April 1858 at Harrow Creek. 47 enslaved people walked bent between the rows of white cotton, knowing they wouldn't escape, even if they ran all the way to the horizon. At 65, Jeremiah looked like a body that had already outlived its limits. Thin skin, visible ribs, stick-like arms, hands trembling even when carrying a bucket of water. When he walked, his shadow on the ground appeared as a crooked, frail line. The younger ones whispered that he only remained alive because he wasn't even worth the trouble of a beating anymore. Thomas Harrow, the plantation's master, had given him the nickname 20 years earlier, laughing loudly enough for everyone to hear. Halfman, and the nickname became a weapon. Halfman, if you spill that water, I'll have your hide torn off. Move, Halfman. You're slower than a dead man. Halfman ain't good for anything. Jeremiah never responded, never looked up, never revealed anything on his face except exhaustion and submission. He had learned long ago that invisibility was a form of armor, that being beneath notice was safer than being seen. The overseers rarely bothered with him anymore. Pike, the head overseer, with his red beard and constant sneer, would occasionally shove him or spit near his feet. But mostly Jeremiah was left alone to do the light work, mending baskets, feeding chickens, carrying water, fixing fence posts that younger men had cracked in half with their greater strength. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that Jeremiah Grant carried inside his wasted frame a secret that was older than half the white men on the plantation, a secret that lived in his muscles and tendons, and in the deep places of memory, where his father's voice still whispered across 53 years of silence. Solomon Grant had been a tall man with hands that could palm a watermelon, and a way of moving through the world that suggested he was only pretending to be enslaved, that some essential part of him remained sovereign and untouchable. When Jeremiah was 12 years old, still growing into the body that would later be broken down by decades of labor, Solomon taught him something forbidden. They would slip away on Sunday afternoons, when the white folks were in town at church, down to the creek that cut through the property like a silver scar. Solomon would pull from inside his shirt a length of braided leather, worked and reworked until it was supple as a snake, with a pouch in the middle and 2 loose ends. "This here's a sling," Solomon said the first time, his voice barely above the creek's murmur. "Same thing David used on Goliath. But that's about all the white man's Bible got right. This ain't no toy. This is how we stay alive when they think they got all the power." Solomon showed him how to choose stones from the creek bed, smooth and round, about the size of a quail egg, how to test the weight, how to feel which ones wanted to fly. Then came the stance, the grip, the rotation. The sling wasn't thrown, Solomon explained. It was an extension of your arm, a circle of leather that gathered speed and momentum until the stone became a bullet. "Feel the wind," Solomon said, guiding Jeremiah's thin arm through the motion. "Count in your head. 1 rotation to gather, 2 rotations to aim, 3 rotations to release. Let the leather talk to you. It'll tell you when." It took Jeremiah 3 months to hit his first rabbit. The stone caught it mid-hop at 15 yards, and the animal dropped like it had been struck by lightning. Solomon smiled, which was rare, and squeezed his son's shoulder. "You got the gift," he said. "But listen to me close now. Don't never tell nobody about this. Not your friends, not your mama, not a soul. A Negro with a weapon is a dead Negro. But a Negro with a secret weapon, well, that's something else. That's a free man waiting for his moment." For 4 years, Jeremiah practiced in secret. Rabbits, possums, birds in flight. Once he brought down a young deer with a stone to the temple that dropped it mid-stride. He and Solomon ate well those nights, cooking the meat deep in the woods where the smoke wouldn't be seen. Then came the day everything changed. Before we continue this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe and comment which city you're watching from. Let's keep going. 3 enslaved men from a neighboring plantation were caught hunting with slings. It didn't matter that they were trying to feed their children. It didn't matter that the master kept them on half rations. The white men saw weapons in black hands and responded the only way they knew how, with violence that was meant to be seen and remembered. The 3 men were whipped in the public square in town, 30 lashes each, and then hanged from the same oak tree where white children played in the summer. Their bodies were left there for 3 days as a message. That night, old Master Harrow, Thomas's father, called all his enslaved people to the yard and made a pronouncement. Any Negro found with a sling, a rope for throwing, or any other projectile instrument would receive 50 lashes and be sold south to the sugar plantations, where life expectancy was measured in seasons, not years. Solomon burned his sling that night. Jeremiah watched the leather curl and blacken in the fire, watched his father's face, which showed nothing. When the flames had died to embers, Solomon pulled his 12-year-old son close. "I burned the leather," Solomon whispered, "but I can't burn what's in here." He tapped Jeremiah's chest right over his heart. "Nobody can take that. You remember that. Nobody can take what you carry inside." Jeremiah never made another sling, never threw another stone with intention. Solomon died of fever when Jeremiah was 19, and Jeremiah was sold away 2 years later, then sold again, then again, each time moving further from everyone he'd known until he was just another aging slave that nobody wanted. Worth almost nothing at auction, Thomas Harrow bought him for $5 in Savannah when Jeremiah was 45. Might get another 10 years out of him. Harrow told the auctioneer, "If he don't die first, look at him. He's half a man already." The name stuck, Halfman. Like he wasn't complete, like something essential had been carved away. But on certain mornings, before the sun rose and turned the world into a furnace, Jeremiah would walk down to the creek. He'd reach into the cold water and pull out a smooth stone. He'd feel the weight of it, test the balance. His fingers would curl around it in a grip that hadn't been used in decades. And something deep in his shoulders and back and arms would remember. The memory was stored in his body like words in a book, waiting to be read again. He never acted on it, never let himself think too long about what he could do, because thinking about it meant thinking about everything else. The injustice, the cruelty, the casual evil of men like Thomas Harrow, who believed that owning other human beings was not just acceptable but righteous. But the skill was there, dormant, patient, waiting. Thomas Harrow woke on the morning of April 13th, 1858, in the same brass bed where he'd been born, in the same room his father had slept in, under the same portrait of his grandfather that hung on the wall like a judge looking down on all proceedings. He was 50 years old, in what he considered to be the prime of his life, and he had never once questioned whether the world he inhabited was just. He owned 47 human beings. He never called them that. They were his Negroes or his people, or sometimes, when he was feeling particularly magnanimous, his workers. He prided himself on being a fair master, not like some of the plantation owners he knew who ruled through terror alone. Thomas gave his enslaved people new clothes twice a year. He allowed them to sing on Sundays. He didn't separate mothers from children unless absolutely necessary for economic reasons. These things in his mind made him a good man. His wife, Margaret, knew better. But Margaret had learned long ago that speaking uncomfortable truths to Thomas Harrow was like throwing water on a grease fire. It only made things worse. So she kept her eyes on her embroidery and her mouth shut and tried not to hear the screams that sometimes came from the yard when Thomas decided someone needed correction. Their son Robert was 23 and becoming a problem. The boy had gone to college in Charleston for 2 years and come back with ideas that Thomas found disturbing. Ideas about education for Negroes, about gradual emancipation, about the inherent dignity of all human souls. Dangerous ideas. Just last week, Robert had said something unforgivable at the dinner table. They'd been discussing a 15-year-old field hand who'd collapsed from heat exhaustion, and Robert had suggested in his quiet, hesitant way that perhaps they should allow more water breaks during the hottest part of the day. "Are you questioning how I run this plantation?" Thomas had asked, his voice going very quiet in the way that meant violence was close. "I'm just saying, Father, that a dead slave is worth nothing, and a healthy slave is worth." Thomas had struck him across the face hard enough that Robert's glasses flew off and skittered across the floor. Margaret had gasped and put her hand to her mouth. Robert had sat there with a red mark blooming on his cheek, eyes watering. But he hadn't cried. That was almost worse. If he'd cried, Thomas could have forgiven him as weak. But Robert just looked at him with something like pity, and that was intolerable. Thomas needed to reassert control, not just over Robert, but over the entire plantation. He needed a demonstration of power that would remind everyone, white and black, of the natural order of things. He needed an example. That's when Dina, the house cook, came to him with a problem. 3 chickens had gone missing from the coop. No sign of foxes or wild dogs. The fence was intact, which meant someone had stolen them. Thomas felt a surge of something almost like gratitude. Here was an opportunity delivered by Providence itself. "Call Pike," he told Dina. "Tell him we need to find out who's been thieving." Pike arrived within minutes, as he always did when summoned. The man lived to serve, or more accurately, he lived to have power over those beneath him in the hierarchy. He couldn't command white men, but he could make the enslaved people's lives into a hell on earth, and that was enough for him. "We got a thief." "Pike," Thomas said. 3 chickens gone from the coop. I want to know who did it, and I want them punished publicly today, this afternoon. I want every Negro on this plantation to see what happens to thieves." Pike's eyes lit up. "Yes, sir. I know just the one." "You do?" "Hoffman. That old skeleton, Jeremiah Grant. He's always lurking around the chicken coop. Says he's getting water, but I seen him looking at those birds. It's him, sure as I'm standing here." It wasn't true, and Pike knew it. Jeremiah passed by the chicken coop because it was on the path between the slave quarters and the creek. But Pike needed a scapegoat, and Jeremiah was perfect. Too old to fight back, too weak to resist, expendable. Thomas nodded slowly. The more he thought about it, the more perfect it became. Not some young buck full of rage and strength who might actually put up a fight and embarrass him. Not a woman whose suffering might be too disturbing even for the other enslaved people to watch without resentment building. But an old man, a used-up piece of property that everyone already thought of as worthless. Halfman. The name itself did half the work. Who would object to punishing someone who was already considered less than whole? "Bring him to the yard at noon," Thomas said. "And call everyone, every single Negro. I want them all to see." "What about the white folks, sir?" "My family will watch from the porch. You and your men will maintain order. This needs to be done right, Pike. This needs to be memorable." Pike grinned. "Oh, it will be, sir. I promise you that." Jeremiah was sitting in the dim coolness of the slave quarters, working on a basket that had split along one side. His fingers, though gnarled with age, were still precise. He could weave the willow strips back together so perfectly that you couldn't see where the break had been. It was mindless work, the kind that let his thoughts drift to other places, other times. He was thinking about Solomon, about the way his father's hands had moved when braiding the leather for the sling, the focused intensity. That was almost like prayer. About the feeling of the first successful throw. The way the stone had left his hand and flew true, the way the rabbit had dropped like it had been struck by God himself. About the night Solomon burned the sling and whispered that nobody could take what you carried inside. That's when Pike's shadow fell across him. "Get up, Halfman." Jeremiah looked up slowly. Pike had two younger overseers with him, both carrying short clubs. This wasn't good. This was never good. "Yes, sir." Jeremiah's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "You stole 3 chickens from Master Harrow's coop." Not a question, a statement. An accusation that had already been judged and sentenced. Jeremiah felt his stomach drop, but he kept his face still. "No, sir. I never stole nothing. Never have." "You calling me a liar, old man?" "No, sir. Just saying I didn't take no chickens." "Wouldn't do that." Pike spat on the ground near Jeremiah's bare feet. "We'll see what the master has to say about that. You're coming to the yard. Noon. Everyone's going to watch you get what thieves deserve." The other enslaved people in the quarters had gone silent. Some looked away. Some looked at Jeremiah with pity. A few of the women were already crying quietly because they knew what the yard meant. It meant blood and screaming and the crack of the whip. It meant being made an example of, as Pike and his men grabbed Jeremiah roughly by the arms and hauled him to his feet. Something strange happened. For 53 years, Jeremiah had been obedient. For 53 years, he had kept his head down and his mouth shut and survived by being invisible. For 53 years, he had carried his secret skill locked away in the deepest parts of himself, never using it, never even acknowledging it. But as they dragged him toward the door, his right hand brushed against the torn hem of his pants, where 3 days ago, for reasons he hadn't fully understood at the time, he had hidden a length of braided leather. 2 yards of it, worked carefully in the dead of night while everyone else slept, his fingers remembering movements they hadn't made in more than half a century, and in the torn pocket of his shirt, 3 stones from the creek. Smooth, round, perfect. He hadn't known why he'd made the sling, hadn't known why he'd collected the stones. It had felt like instinct, like his body was preparing for something his mind hadn't yet accepted. Now, being dragged toward what would certainly be a public beating and possibly his death, Jeremiah understood. His body had known before his mind. His hands had known before his heart. The moment had arrived. The yard at Harrow Creek Plantation was a space of packed, red clay between the manor house with its white columns and the long, low buildings of the slave quarters. In the center stood a thick post of oak, 10 feet tall, dark with old blood stains that had soaked into the wood over decades of use. Iron rings were bolted to it at different heights. A bullwhip hung coiled on a hook nearby, its 9 braided tails ending in knots that could tear flesh to the bone. By noon, the sun was directly overhead, offering no shade, no mercy. Thomas Harrow stood on the porch of his house in a clean white shirt and black vest, his arms crossed. His face set in an expression of righteous judgment. Margaret sat in a chair behind him, working on her embroidery with mechanical precision, her face carefully blank. Robert stood near the door, looking like he might be sick. Pike had gathered all 47 enslaved people into a semicircle around the post. The field hands were there, still dirty from the morning's work, the house servants, the children, some of them so young they didn't understand what was happening, but could feel the fear coming off the adults, like heat from a fire. The elderly, forced to stand on aching legs to witness this lesson in obedience. Jeremiah was shoved into the center of the circle. Pike and 4 other overseers stood around the perimeter with clubs, and one with a musket. Nobody was taking chances. Even with an old man, even with someone they called Halfman, they were prepared for trouble. Thomas descended from the porch slowly, each step deliberate. He wanted this moment to carry weight. He wanted everyone to feel his authority. When he reached the center of the yard, he looked at Jeremiah with an expression of disappointed paternalism, like a father about to punish a child for his own good. "Jeremiah Grant," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the yard, "you have stolen from me 3 chickens. In the eyes of God and the law, you have committed theft. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Jeremiah raised his head. For 20 years he had avoided Thomas Harrow's gaze. For 20 years he had looked at the ground when the master passed, had mumbled, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," without ever making eye contact. Now, he looked directly into Thomas Harrow's face. "I didn't steal nothing, Master Harrow. I never stole nothing from you or nobody else." A murmur went through the assembled enslaved people. Several gasped. "You didn't contradict the master. You never contradicted the master." Thomas's face darkened. "So you're not just a thief, you're a liar as well." "I ain't lying, sir. I'm telling the truth. Pike says you're guilty. I believe Pike. You will confess your sin, beg my forgiveness, and accept your punishment. 20 lashes. If you confess now and show proper contrition, we'll leave it at that." Jeremiah said nothing. I said, "You will confess." "Can't confess to something I didn't do." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Thomas's face went red, his hands clenched into fists. "Pike, tie him to the post. 40 lashes. I want him to feel every single one." Pike moved forward, eagerly reaching for Jeremiah's arm. That's when Jeremiah took a step back. It wasn't the stumbling retreat of an old man. It was measured, balanced, purposeful. His right hand went to the hem of his pants, and when it came back up, he was holding something that looked like a length of old rope, or leather, with a pouch in the middle. "What the hell is that?" Pike stopped, confused. Thomas squinted at the object. "What are you doing, old man? You think a piece of rope is going to save you?" Jeremiah didn't answer. His left hand went into his shirt pocket and came out with a smooth round stone. He placed it in the leather pouch with movements that were slow and deliberate. Like someone performing a ritual they'd practiced 10,000 times. Robert on the porch suddenly felt his blood run cold. He'd read classics at college. He'd read about ancient warfare, about the slingers who could bring down armored men from 100 paces. That's what the old man was holding. That's what. "Father," Robert shouted. "Feather, move back. That's a—" "Shut up, Robert." Thomas snapped, not taking his eyes off Jeremiah. He was smiling now, a cruel smile that said he'd already decided how this would end. An old fool with a toy. This would be entertaining before it became educational. "Go ahead," Thomas said, spreading his arms mockingly. "Take your shot, Halfman. Show us what you've got." Jeremiah held the 2 ends of the sling in his right hand. His left hand steadied the pouch with the stone. Then he began to rotate his arm. The motion started slow. A circle at his side, the leather beginning to hum as it cut through the air. The sound was strange, alien, something nobody there had heard before. But that triggered some deep ancestral fear in the human brain. Thomas's smile faltered. "What are you?" Jeremiah's arm moved faster. The circle became a blur. The humming became a whistle. His thin body, which had seemed so feeble, suddenly looked different. His stance was that of a warrior. His eyes were focused with an intensity that made him seem 20 years younger. 1 rotation, 2 rotations, 3. On the 3rd rotation, Jeremiah released one end of the sling. The stone came out like a musket ball, faster than thought, faster than reaction. It crossed the 8 yards between Jeremiah and Thomas Harrow in less time than it takes a heart to beat. It struck Thomas Harrow in the center of his forehead with a sound like an axe hitting wood. Thomas's head snapped back. His arms dropped to his sides. His eyes went wide with shock and confusion, as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then he fell. He fell like a tree that had been cut through at the base, straight back, heavy and final. His body hit the packed earth with a thud that everyone felt in their chests. Blood began to pool under his head, dark and spreading in the red clay. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He was dead before he finished falling. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The world had just inverted itself in a way that none of them had believed possible. A slave had killed a master. An old man had killed his owner. Halfman had proven he was whole. Then Margaret screamed. It was a high, piercing sound that shattered the frozen moment. She stood from her chair, hands pressed to her face, screaming and screaming. Pike recovered first. His hand went to the whip at his belt, but he was already realizing that a whip wasn't going to be enough. "Kill him!" he roared at the other overseers. "Kill the old man now! Shoot him!" The overseer with the musket raised it, hands shaking. Jeremiah already had another stone in the sling. His arm was rotating again, the motion smooth and practiced, as natural as breathing. 2 overseers with clubs charged forward. Jeremiah released. The stone caught the first overseer in the nose. The sound was of bones shattering. The man went down screaming, blood gushing between his fingers. The second overseer hesitated for just an instant. Jeremiah already had his 3rd stone loaded, already spinning, already releasing. The stone hit the second overseer in the throat. He dropped to his knees, hands clutching at his crushed windpipe, making horrible choking sounds. The overseer with the musket fired, but his hands were shaking so badly that the shot went wide, kicking up dirt 5 feet to Jeremiah's left. Pike dropped his whip and ran. Just turned and ran for the main house, then past it, heading for his own cabin a 1/4 mile away. The other 2 overseers looked at the 3 dead or dying men on the ground, looked at Jeremiah standing there with his leather sling, looked at each other, and made the same decision Pike had. They ran for their horses and didn't stop running until they were off the plantation entirely. The enslaved people stood frozen in their semicircle, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Some of them started crying. Some started praying. Some just stared at Jeremiah like he'd transformed into something divine and terrible right before their eyes. Jeremiah lowered the sling. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the release of 53 years of compressed rage and grief and survival. He looked down at Thomas Harrow's body, at the blood spreading in the dirt, and felt nothing except a vast emptiness, where fear used to live. A young woman named Sarah was the first to move. She stepped forward from the crowd, her 5 children clustered behind her, and spoke in a voice that shook but didn't break. "What happens now?" Jeremiah looked at her, then at the others. "The militia will come. They'll hang me. Probably hang some of you too, just to make a point." An older woman named Esther, who'd been at Harrow Creek even longer than Jeremiah, nodded slowly. "They'll say it was a rebellion. They'll burn the quarters. They'll make an example of all of us." A young man named Moses stepped forward. He was 19, strong, and until this moment had believed that resistance was impossible. "Then we run." Everyone looked at him. "We run," he repeated, his voice getting stronger. "Right now before they get here. We follow the river north. Some of us know the way. Some of us heard about the Underground Railroad. We run or we die. Those are the choices. An older man named Isaiah shook his head. They got dogs. They got horses. They got guns. We won't make it 10 miles. Maybe not, Sarah said. But I'd rather die running than die here on my knees waiting for them to come kill me. She looked at Jeremiah. You coming with us? Jeremiah looked at the sling in his hands, at Solomon's legacy made real after all these years, at the proof that nobody could take what you carried inside. He looked at Thomas Harrow's body and felt the weight of every chain, every scar, every moment of forced silence lift away like morning fog. Yeah, he said, I'm coming. But not as a runaway slave, as a free man. Moses grinned, wild and fierce. Then we're all free, starting right now. Any of you coming? 21 people stepped forward. Some of the older ones stayed, too frightened or too broken to believe in the possibility of freedom. Some of the very young stayed with elderly grandparents who couldn't travel. But 21 souls decided that dying running north was better than dying waiting in chains. They had maybe 3 hours before Pike reached the sheriff and the militia was called out. They were going to need every minute. Robert Harrow stood on the porch, watching his father's body cool in the yard, and felt the strangest sense of relief. He'd spent his whole life under the weight of Thomas Harrow's certainty. His father's absolute conviction that the world was ordered exactly as God intended, that some men were meant to rule and others meant to serve, that this was not just practical but holy. Now his father was dead, killed by a man he'd called Halfman, and Robert felt like he could breathe for the first time in 23 years. He walked down the porch steps on shaking legs. The enslaved people who weren't running were watching him warily, waiting to see if he'd call for help, if he'd try to stop them. Robert looked at Jeremiah Grant, at this thin old man who'd just rewritten the rules of the universe with 3 stones and a leather strap. How long until Pike gets to town? Robert asked. Jeremiah studied him carefully. 2 hours, maybe 3. Then you need to move fast. When they come, I'll tell them it was just you, that you went crazy, that the others had nothing to do with it. Maybe they'll believe me, maybe they won't, but it might buy the rest some safety. Sarah frowned. Why would you do that? Robert took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, buying himself a moment to think. Because my father taught me that you were property. Tools, things to be used. And I watched a piece of property kill its owner with nothing but a rock, which means either my father's entire worldview was a lie, or Jeremiah Grant is something other than property. He put his glasses back on and looked directly at Jeremiah. I'm going with the second option. You're a man. You've always been a man. We just refused to see it. Jeremiah nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement between equals. Thank you. Don't thank me, Robert said. Just run. And when you get north, when you're free and safe, remember that not all of us believed in this. Some of us knew it was wrong. We just didn't have your courage. He turned and walked back into the house, leaving them to their escape. They moved fast and quiet, gathering what little they had. No time for sentiment, no time for goodbyes to those who stayed behind. Just movement, purpose, survival. Jeremiah led them, and in that leadership he was transformed. The shuffling old man who'd spent 20 years being invisible was gone. In his place was someone sure-footed and decisive, someone who knew exactly how to read the land and hide their tracks, and keep a group moving through terrain that would kill them if they made mistakes. They followed the creek north, staying in the water when they could to confuse any dogs that would come later. Jeremiah taught them to brush away footprints with branches, to avoid breaking twigs, to move like ghosts. That night they made camp in a ravine half a mile from the main road. No fire. They ate the little food they'd grabbed. Some cornbread, some dried meat, and the children cried quietly until their mothers comforted them to sleep. Moses sat next to Jeremiah, watching the old man check his sling and count his stones like a soldier preparing for battle. "How did you learn to do that?" Moses asked quietly. "My father taught me. A long time ago. Before you were born, before most of these folks were born. Why didn't you ever use it before? All those years you could have." "Could have what?" Jeremiah interrupted gently. "Could have killed a master and got myself hung, and probably half the plantation with me. Could have made a grand gesture that changed nothing except who was in the ground. My father told me to wait, to keep the skill hidden, to be patient. And today it was time. Today they gave me no choice. And today," Jeremiah paused, looking at the stars through the tree canopy above. "Today, there were enough of us ready to run. That's what made the difference. Wasn't just me and my stones. Was all of us deciding that living free was worth dying for." Sarah joined them, having just gotten her youngest to sleep. "How far you think we got to go?" "Ohio River is about 150 miles north. If we can cross that, we're in free territory. But they'll come after us tomorrow, next day, at the latest. We need to move fast and smart. Can we make it before we continue? If you've made it this far, write freedom in the comments so I know who you are. Thank you, and let's keep going." Jeremiah looked at her, at this young woman who'd chosen freedom for herself and her children, and saw in her face the same fierce determination that had lived in Solomon's face 53 years ago. "We're going to try," he said, "and trying's more than we could do yesterday." For 6 days they moved north, and for 6 days Jeremiah kept them alive. He hunted silently with his sling, bringing down rabbits and squirrels that he roasted over small smokeless fires built in deep holes. He found water. He chose paths that avoided farms and roads. He kept them moving when they wanted to stop, and made them rest when they thought they could go farther. On the second day, they heard dogs in the distance. Jeremiah made them wade through a creek for 2 miles, then walk across bare rock for another mile, then climb trees and travel through the branches before coming down and continuing north. The dogs lost the trail. On the 4th day, Isaiah collapsed from fever. They carried him for half a day, but he was dead weight and they were all exhausted. That night, Isaiah died. They buried him in a shallow grave and said what prayers they knew. And then they kept moving because stopping meant dying. On the 7th day, exhausted and half-starved, they reached the Ohio River. The border between slavery and freedom was a wide band of brown water, maybe 400 feet across, moving swift and strong. On the other side was Ohio, was free soil, was the possibility of a life where nobody owned them. They were standing there, trying to figure out how to cross when 15 men on horseback appeared from the tree line behind them. The militia had caught up. Their leader was a heavy man with a gray beard and a slouch hat carrying a percussion cap, rifle across his saddle. His name was Dalton, and he was the county sheriff. Behind him were 14 other men, farmers and shop owners and professional slave catchers, all armed. Dalton dismounted slowly, his rifle pointed casually in the direction of the fugitives. "Y'all had a good run," he said, his voice almost friendly. "Made it farther than most do, but it's over now. You got 2 choices. Come back peaceful and take your punishment or resist and get shot. Either way, you ain't crossing that river." The fugitives stood frozen. The children were crying. Sarah held them close. Moses and the other men looked at Jeremiah, waiting for him to say something, to do something, to work one more miracle. Jeremiah took 1 step forward, positioning himself between the militia and his people. He still had the sling tucked in his belt. He had 5 stones left in his pockets. "We ain't going back," Jeremiah said quietly. Dalton sighed. "Old man, I don't want to shoot you, but I will if you make me. You killed a white man. You know what that means. You're going to hang. Why make it worse? Can't be worse than going back to chains. Last chance. Come peaceful or die here." Jeremiah pulled the sling from his belt and loaded a stone. Dalton's eyes widened. "What the hell is that?" "Something old," Jeremiah said. "Something they thought they'd made us forget." He began to spin the sling. Dalton raised his rifle, but he was already too slow, already too late. The stone flew before his finger found the trigger. It hit Dalton's right hand, the one holding the rifle. The sound of bones breaking was like dry wood snapping. Dalton screamed and dropped the rifle, staring at his ruined hand in shock. "Kill them," one of the other militiamen shouted, and suddenly there were muskets and rifles firing, smoke and noise and chaos. But Jeremiah was already moving, already spinning, already releasing. Another stone caught a man in the temple, and he fell from his horse. Another stone shattered a jaw. The mounted men were trying to aim, but their horses were panicking from the gunfire and the screaming. And Jeremiah was a moving target, thin and quick despite his age. Moses and the other men charged forward with rocks and branches, no longer willing to die passively. They pulled riders from horses. They fought with the desperate strength of people who had nothing to lose. The battle was brief and brutal. 3 more militiamen went down from Jeremiah's stones. 2 were beaten unconscious by Moses and the others. The remaining men, seeing half their number dead or dying, turned their horses and fled. In the sudden silence, the fugitives stood among the dead, breathing hard, covered in blood and dirt. "Cross now," Jeremiah said, his voice steady, "before they come back." They stripped off their clothes, bundled them on their heads, and waded into the Ohio River. The current was strong, and the water was cold, but they held on to each other. The strong supporting the weak, the adults carrying the children. Jeremiah went last, making sure everyone made it. When he finally pulled himself onto the far bank, his old body shaking with exhaustion, Sarah reached down and helped him up. "Welcome to Ohio," she said, smiling through tears. "Welcome to freedom." They found help from a Quaker family 3 miles north of the river. The Hadleys fed them, gave them clothes and shelter, and connected them with the Underground Railroad. From there, they traveled to Cincinnati, then to Canada. Not all of them made it. 2 children died of fever during the journey north. An elderly woman named Esther passed away peacefully in her sleep in a safe house in Cincinnati. But 17 souls made it to Canada, to true freedom, to a place where nobody could legally own them. Jeremiah Grant lived to be 82 years old. He never picked cotton again. He never bowed to any man. He worked as a carpenter in Toronto, married a freedwoman named Ruth, and had 3 children who grew up knowing that their father had once killed a master with nothing but a stone and a length of leather. He never made another sling. He kept the old one tucked away in a drawer, along with 3 smooth stones from the Ohio River that he'd picked up on the day he crossed over into freedom. Sometimes his grandchildren would ask him to show them how it worked. And he'd take them out to a field and demonstrate, sending stones whistling through the air to hit targets 100 feet away with the same precision he'd had when he was young. "How did you learn to do that, Grandpa?" they'd ask. And Jeremiah would tell them about Solomon, about secret lessons by a creek in Georgia, about a skill hidden for 53 years, about the difference between being owned and being free. "Your great-grandfather told me something I never forgot," Jeremiah would say. "He said they can take everything from you. Your name, your family, your body, your time. But they can't take what's inside unless you let them. What you learn, what you know, what you carry in your heart and your hands, that's yours forever. And when the moment comes, when you need it, it'll be there waiting. Were you scared, Grandpa, when you fought the master? Jeremiah thought about that for a long time before answering. Yeah, he finally said. I was scared. But I was more scared of staying a slave. I was more scared of never knowing what it felt like to stand up. Your great-grandfather taught me to use that sling, but more important, he taught me that I was a man. A whole man, not half, not less, whole. And once you know that, really know it in your bones, then you can't ever go back to pretending you're not. He died in his sleep in 1875, 17 years after killing Thomas Harrow. He was buried in a cemetery in Toronto under a headstone that read Jeremiah Grant, Free Man. And in his coffin, tucked into his coat pocket, where nobody would see them, were 3 smooth stones and a leather sling, waiting with him for whatever came next.